Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's early Thursday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in, but let's jump in and see what we got. First up, 60 FPS was planning to help a buddy test a front projection setup for latency. Can they use Mr. Laggy for that, or would they be wasting their time? You should be able to, but let me continue reading your question. Their tentative plan is to get the room as dark as possible and then put the sensor in the usual white rectangle zones facing towards the projector. He says we won't have to worry about any light from the room. They imagine we'd have to mask off some stuff like any little LEDs on the projector and put their diagnostics monitor under a blanket or something. So I don't think you need to start with that. And I vaguely remember doing it a couple times in the past, and one time it worked and the other it didn't. But the time that it didn't, I was in a room with that you couldn't really black out the room and it was daytime, so I'm sure that was just it. But I was actually just watching a whole bunch of videos from the channel The Hookup about projectors and stuff, and they seem to be able to use the Leo Bodnar tester without any problems whatsoever. So I would say that the Mr. Laggy should work just as well. I would just start with the easiest, right? Just kind of turn the lights off in the room, shut the windows, and then just hold the sensor up and see what happens. And obviously hold it in multiple places so that way you could tell if there's, a different reading. That means it's an accurate measurement, and that should be fine. You might have to do stuff like actually holding it a little closer to the projector, but still within the beam of light. You might have to move something else or mask off LEDs, but generally speaking, it should just work okay. And I think it'll work fine. Also, expect higher readings than you would from any flat panel. You could get lucky and get one of the low latency ones, but some of the projectors I've seen, even in their quote unquote game mode, have over 100 milliseconds of latency. That could be a fluke. It could be something that needs to be fixed in a firmware update. But I'm just saying, if you get like 36 milliseconds of latency, that should be not okay, but it's not unexpected for something like a projector. But luckily, some of the newer ones do have game modes that drop to 20 milliseconds for 60 hertz and even lower for 120 hertz for ones that support it. But I'll leave a link to the projector channel, or to the channel that I was watching the projector videos. And if anybody's familiar with it, let me know your opinions. Because, as somebody who's been doing YouTube for over a decade, I'm always very skeptical of everybody until I kind of test myself and verify their info. And you could say that I'm just being negative and ass about this, but I've just been burned quite a few times by people who look really confident, but their test methods are not sound. And this channel seems to be the opposite of that, with actual test methods and real equipment and stats to prove their testing. So I think they seem like a great channel, but let me know your thoughts on it. I'm always open to people's opinions, and I always want to be pointed in the right direction for this stuff. Next, Christopher Skurick wants my opinion on how I would play modern pixel art games via a CRT. Would I use a specific PC with analog-capable graphics cards, or would I rather use a modern console like a Switch and downscale it with the OSSC Pro or RetroTink? So, I have a couple of different answers for that, but generally speaking, doing digital to analog conversion with stuff like those very cheap HDMI to VGA converters and then using like an HD15 to SCART or something like that is a great way to do it. And it also would depend on what resolution I wanted to go to, because if I just wanted to go to 480p, I might just play a game on Steam and then set the second output of my graphics card. So my display is connected via DisplayPort. I would have the HDMI output going to that DAC, and I would set that to like 640 by 480, and that would be an excellent solution. But if I wanted to go down to 480i or 240p, I would definitely get some kind of downscaler, and both of the ones that you mentioned are absolutely perfect for that. OSSC Pro and the RetroTink 4Ks, or even 5X, you just would need then a digital to analog converter to get it into the RetroTink 5X, but that still would work great. But I would really rely on downscaling for most scenarios, simply because even if you built a dedicated PC, outputting 240p or 480i could be tricky and inconsistent. And I know there's going to be people listening that are already angry, like, no, mine's been working perfectly for years. And I'm very happy for you. But as somebody who's been tinkering with this stuff for well over a decade now, I can tell you that when I had a scenario like I built a Windows PC to only put inside an arcade machine, this was long before Raspberry Pis got powerful enough to do this stuff, that was very consistent. But anytime I had a multi-use system, it was never reliable to do that. So I couldn't just use my main PC or even like a gaming PC that I sometimes use for 240p. It would always be inconsistent. So I would rather rely on downscaling. You could even get a cheaper one like a GBS control and try to use that one. You would need some more converters, but you could save some money over time if you wanted to do it that way. But yeah, downscaling is definitely how I would focus on this. And I would just also pick and choose which CRT I wanted to use and why. So, HD CRTs, you could just feed them 480p, and almost all of them are going to look absolutely awesome in that resolution. PC CRT monitors could accept 480p, but consumer CRTs and your average RGB monitor, you're going to need to downscale to 240p or 480i, and that's when all of the stuff Marco talks about is key. So I'll leave a link to the downscaling section of the website. It's basically 100% written by Marco, and I would just go through for anybody who's curious and check out those videos. And for you, Christopher, you obviously are already familiar with this stuff, so I would maybe just check out both the Tink 4Ks and OSSC Pro downscaling videos and see which one makes the most sense for you. And I believe Marcus is coming out with a firmware update for the OSSC Pro that might add some more TV and movie specific downscaling stuff as well. I've been talking to him about that. I don't think it's 100% official yet or anything, but from a price standpoint, the OSSC Pro seems to be the go-to downscaler. It's not cheap, but if you put that in the context of what a lot of us used to pay for the Super Emotia, that's not as good, than, unless you're doing compositor S video. But in most cases, it's not as good. It's actually really cool to see the OSSC Pro be so feature-filled for about the price that many of us used to spend on just the Super Emotias. So I'll leave a link to the downscaling section if you're interested. But great question. But for me, I'd be downscaling as much as I could just because it's very consistent and much easier. Next up, Tim the Gamer 23 said they loved the backstory of the RetroRGB theme song and the link to the video of the band playing Live Your Way. Thank you very much, Tim. That was nice of you. They even bought the main song on iTunes. Thank you for that too. Is there somewhere you could buy the 8-bit version from? No, that one's just available for free, but I guess if you want the MP3, I could try to link to it. I'll see if I could just put the MP3 in the description, and feel free to download it. It's just a fun one for people. But thanks for asking for that. And what are the chances of a 2 weeks reunion? So I haven't really talked to anybody. I talked to the last drummer we had, Kendall, who's amazing. I kept in touch with him. I still sort of do. Amazing drummer. I follow his work. I buy the albums that he's on and stuff like that. I haven't really talked to the twins, Gina and Joey, for a while now. But a big problem also is the time that I have, which is 0, and the fact that I don't know how long it would take me to be able to get my chops up to play those songs. Because while we didn't write the songs to be complicated, some of them had some very complicated parts. And it might not sound it because that's kind of the trick, right? If you're playing a really, really hard part and it sounds like you're struggling, you're not doing your job. So the stuff that doesn't, there's a lot of stuff on that album that doesn't really sound hard unless you try to break it down and play it. And it would take a while. My guess, just a total guess, without having picked up a guitar in a long time, if somebody said, hey, we want you to play a gig and we want you to play, half of your album on a cover song, how long until you're ready? I would say 3 months of practicing multiple times a week before I got the chops up to be able to play the way I used to. But I haven't tried. So maybe that's a really, really ambitious guess. Maybe it's 6 months. Maybe it's a year. Maybe I'm too old and I can't do it anymore. I don't know. Because don't forget, a lot of those musicians that Dream Theater, Symphony X, they tour constantly. So they always have their chops up. And when they go home from tour, if they don't play for 2 months, that's probably just great time to let their arms heal so that they grab it, take a couple of weeks to dust the cobwebs off, and then they're ready to go again. So yeah, I would love to someday. I'd also really love to finish that second album because, once again, no disrespect, I don't care if nobody else likes it. I loved those songs, and the ones on the second album, some of them were my favorites. So I'd still love to try that, but I need to get time to do it, and I need to get the skill set up to do it, and I don't ever want to embarrass myself because, while I don't really want to throw shade, I will say that my friend's band, Answer Infinity, I've seen them a lot, and I love that band. But occasionally they have openers that they haven't picked. It's the venue's opener that were so bad. One of them made me actually sick. They were all tone deaf. When I say tone deaf, I'm not being like, oh, they missed note number 4 in song. I mean, like, they didn't tune their instruments. I have no idea how you could be up on stage playing and nobody's in tune with each other at all. It gave me such a bad headache and made me nauseous. It was just like a noise machine. It was like the Havana syndrome thing. Like, so I had to go for a walk around the block and come back. And there's been a bunch of openers I've seen over the years that were that bad. And I would rather never touch a guitar again than have somebody walk away from one of my gigs and say, they were so bad, I had to leave because I was getting sick. So I don't think I'm that bad now, but I might be. I don't know. So yeah. So fun questions. Thank you so much for, for buying it and listening to it. And I really do hope people like the music, but if you hate it, that's totally fine too. Music is completely subjective, and whatever you want to listen to is your choice. But for me personally, I wouldn't play on stage again unless I was confident that I wouldn't make a complete ass of myself. Mistakes are fine, but being able to trying to do something you know you can't do is not. And I don't want to be able to do that, but I do miss it. It was really like the greatest feelings. One of the greatest feelings I've ever had was like, I think I've told this before, so I'll make this super quick, but you open for a band, everybody else is there to see that band. They all go walk away when you start playing, and 3 songs in, half the crowd is back up like, who the hell are them? Like, that's a great feeling because you earn that. And if I wasn't able to do that, just don't want to do it. Last week, Broser wanted to know, would I pick up an Omega MVS with the replacement RGB board, or would I get the open MVS? And I gave an answer based on different scenarios, but Broser came back and said they're feeding RGB into a RetroTink 5X into an LG CX OLED. So in that case, either one is excellent. Pick whichever one that your budget and how it looks would you would prefer. So some people might like the look of one shell over the other. One might be more expensive, so maybe pick the cheaper one. But Tianfeng built the circuits on both of those. They're both identical, and they're both going to perform absolutely top tier. So really just base your decision based on looks and price and go from there, and you could have an absolutely awesome scenario. And through your Tink, or also if you ever get a CRT, an RGB monitor, whatever, you're totally covered. Now, Broser also mentioned some reviewers saying one is brighter than the other, but listen, I know this is going to sound super pompous and it's going to annoy and turn off a lot of people listening, but most of the people who review this stuff don't have any idea what they're doing. They don't even know the questions to ask, let alone how to answer those questions. So are they using the same cable on both? I don't think they could be, because the Omega MVS uses a different cable. What's the cable built like? What are the what's the impedance of the wires? What are the resistors in line if they both use Genesis 2 style cables? Are there different settings or profiles they're going into? Are there there's so many different factors in this, and I wouldn't trust any of that. Also, just remember, as a general rule when it comes to analog video, brightness brighter does not mean better. It could, but almost always it doesn't. And this is something that I have proven with an oscilloscope, with screenshots, with different measurements. I really bent over backwards to prove this a couple of times, because there were some smart people that didn't believe me when I was talking about this stuff, even though it didn't come from me. It came from people way smarter than me. But I proved without a shadow of a doubt that if you do something like, let's take a Super Nintendo and you have it outputting at like 790, 800 millivolts. If you walk over to that and you have it next to, let's just say you have 2 RetroTink 5Xs running generic mode into 2 brand new identical monitors with the exact same settings on it, and you have that next to one outputting 650 millivolts. At first, you might be like, oh, that one's brighter. I think that one looks better. But once you start to analyze the video, you start to realize that if it gets past a certain threshold, you start losing information. So if you were to turn up the brightness on the dimmer one to match, you would actually notice far more detail in the little things, like where colors are close together. Like when I say far more detail, if you put your face up to the monitor, from a normal viewing distance, it would still look better. But as you start to kind of dig in, you could really see how much image and how much data is being lost on the too bright one. And the brighter you go, the more it's being lost. And when you turn down the brightness, you're just dimming the image that's already missing data. Whereas on something that's not too dim. It's not super dim. You could totally just play it as is. If you raise the brightness on that one, you're raising the brightness of the full image with all of the data in it. So as a general rule, don't ever just automatically let your brain think brighter is better. And in fact, in the world of analog video, it's way safer to default to the opposite. Even if your brain immediately thinks like, oh, that one's brighter, it looks better, just go, you know what? I'm going to go with a dimmer one for now. And that actually also applies to the original board of the Omega MVS, not the replacement board. The original board is much dimmer than the replacement because of the circuit that Quan had to design that accepted and outputted so many different signals. Props for that. It was a perfect trade-off of everything that you would need. But if you turned up the brightness on the original board, you could totally get the details to match. It would just be sharper with the replacement one. So hopefully I put all that stuff into context, because I think while the brighter is better thing wasn't totally the focus of your question, I really wanted to drive that point home to everybody listening. But just to swing back one last time to answer your question, pick whichever one of those that you prefer to look at and that you have the budget for. And if you do the Omega, I would absolutely get the replacement board, but keep the original, because you never know. Maybe you want component output, or maybe you want the other signals. That's awesome. At least you have the option for both. But yeah, it's definitely, don't think brighter is better. Next up, DW623 moved from a small town to a big city apartment about a year ago, but because of life, they just now booted up their CRT for the first time since they lived in a small town. And back in the small town, the CRT looked totally fine and there wasn't any problems, but now that they powered it on in the city, they're getting warping on the sides. And they were wondering, could it be the power lines right outside their apartment that's causing it? And my guess is 99.9% absolutely not. That would not be a factor, because you would be seeing interference in other ways. Also, how are you connecting the CRT? Because I showed a video a while back and I re-included that footage in a bunch of other videos. I'll link to it if you're interested. But I took the same exact Super Nintendo RF adapter and CRT, and I showed a video of it in my New York City apartment, and then I showed a video of the same exact everything, same power supply, same extension cord, everything, in a storage area in the middle of nowhere. And in the storage area, RF looked basically identical to composite on a CRT, but in my New York City apartment, it was almost unviewable because of so much interference. So my guess is that could be what you're seeing. If you're not using RF video, the other clue that you gave me is it's been about a year since you've used it. So you have a CRT that's 30 years old-ish, right? Maybe it's 20, maybe it's 40, whatever. But then you pick it up and you move it, and now it's bouncing around and jiggling, and you leave it in a corner somewhere. And if you're in a big city apartment and you went through a winter, maybe if you have it in the corner next to their heaters, it's drying everything out. Now you plug it in and the capacitors could just be all messed up and not able to keep that signal uniform and make it all wobbly. I'll leave a link to the video that you posted that shows it really well for anybody that's interested. So my guess here is that it's not power lines, and probably couldn't be. If you're talking about RF connection, that's definitely the case. And if you're talking about composite video, it could be capacitors or other factors. The easiest way to test it would be the next time you go somewhere out of town, just bring your CRT with you and a console and see what happens. But my gut is telling me that it's either capacitors, RF, or both, and not really anything that you'd be able to get around without either testing it outside of the city or trying to repair it or upgrade it or anything like that. And just a quick reason as to why. Analog video broadcast signals were discontinued because the FCC needed to say, okay, we want to use this range of frequencies for other stuff. So that's one of the main reasons why if you have something like RF and antennas on your CRT, you're not going to be able to use it in a big city where there's tons of other wireless networks using that same or similar frequencies, because you're going to have all of that interference. And also just the sheer number of wireless devices and networks. If you're in the middle of nowhere, you have every device that's in your house with a wireless chip is going to be creating interference, which is not much, all things considered. It's why where I live now, I could fire up a CRT with RF and it looks excellent. But if you're in a big city, you have thousands upon thousands of devices right there. routers, cell phones, streaming TV boxes, everything you could imagine, refrigerators now, anything with a wireless chip is creating interference that's going to mess with RF video. So I guess that would be my two follow-up questions are you connecting RF? Because if so, that's definitely the case. And if it's composite video, is there a way for you to test it outside the city again? Because if the problem follows the apartment, then it's almost surely something to do with the apartment. And if it follows the CRT, that's going to be most likely capacitors or something else in there. So good question. That was a fun one, but I'll leave a link to show you what I mean about the differences between interference and stuff like that. Next up, Tony Escobar wants to know if I could take a moment to talk about the different kinds of BVMs, what makes them desirable, and why the most desirable ones are so desirable, especially over PVMs and stuff like that. So PVM, professional video monitor, is just a moniker that means a CRT that has more accuracy and a little built to be a little bit more robust than a consumer CRT. And a BVM, a broadcast video monitor, are where the utmost quality is of key importance. So a PVM would be used for security cameras where you need it to run 24/7 all the time. So you needed it to be able to last that long, deal with a little more heat, a little more tolerances and stuff. Could also be a medical imaging monitor. So you wanted to be able to see your X-rays on a display with more detail than a standard consumer CRT and stuff like that. And the medical stuff was probably a little older because once PC CRT monitors came in, that kind of beat it. But so PVMs were always just supposed to be a little bit better. Now, BVMs were supposed to be I don't care how much it costs. We need to calibrate a, $100 million movie to make sure it looks good in the theaters and at home. So I need a display that is the most accurate detail as possible. So that's one of the big factors of BVMs is the amount of detail on screen and the ability to calibrate as much of the screen as possible far exceeds consumer CRTs and is even better than PVMs. Also, a lot of the BVMs supported multiple resolutions. So not just 15 kilohertz, 240p and 480i, but you could also do 480p, 720p, and 1080i on a bunch of them. Now, the L series PVMs did this too, and some of the Ikagamis did as well, but it wasn't nearly as common. And so generally speaking, you grab like a D or an A series BVM and you could have all of those resolutions. Now, the ones that don't support 480p or higher are still excellent, but that's definitely part of it. Also, you could get BVMs in widescreen sizes, which are still super rare, but you can get the 24-inch and the 32-inch BVMs, which they're both ridiculously rare, especially the 32. But now you have yourself a giant, gorgeous 32-inch screen that you could use for widescreen or 4x3 in all of those different resolutions, and it's just amazingly good. Now, of course, just like higher-end cars, the higher end of the display, the more maintenance it's going to need, because to keep it that perfect, you need to constantly be tweaking it. And these broadcast centers would have Sony service techs come in on a regular basis to check and replace the capacitors, redo the calibration, and all of that other stuff. Some bigger ones probably had dedicated techs on hand to do that. So it's just like buying a Lamborghini where you got to rebuild the motor every 50,000 miles or something like that, or whatever it used to be. The higher end of the equipment, the more maintenance it would require to keep it that high end. So BVMs were more desirable simply because it could possibly be the best experience. But as time went on, the much more important factor, I guess this is an opinion, but it's also rooted in fact, the much more important factor is the condition of the tube and the CRT itself. So if you have a BVM with a beat up, yellowed old tube, and you have a consumer CRT that was, let's just say, old stock, new in box, found somewhere, and you replace all the capacitors and you calibrate both, even though the BVM will technically be more accurate and the geometry would be better, it's not going to look as good as the consumer TV because it's going to be dull and yellowed and maybe some burn-in or something like that. So what makes it better is partially subjective, but those are the other reasons. The other explanation is why they could have been better brand new side by side with other stuff. There's no chance you could ever calibrate a consumer CRT to the levels of a BVM, and none of them had even remotely close to as much detail. One other thing I will absolutely add, though, is with devices like the RetroTink 4K and OLED TVs and stuff like Kuro's mask emulation, or you could do some of the tweaking that I've done and get Kuro went for CRT accurate. Sometimes I go for a mythical, what would a 4K CRT look like type of thing. And you could get the sharpest image you could imagine. So after seeing that for years now, my eyes very often will prefer the lower TVL, the ones, maybe not a consumer CRT, but a lower TVL PVM, so you could see the mask more defined than on a BVM. And that is 100% subjective, because there were a couple of years that all I cared about was the sharpest CRT on the planet, and I loved that experience. But I kind of do get that very close to that now with the Tink and the OLEDs. So it's really up to everybody's eyes to decide, and your opinions may evolve as mine did over the years. So that's kind of why I always go back to the same statement I've made forever. Any CRT that works is an amazing choice for everything pre-Dreamcast. Anything that's only 480i and 240p, that's really going to be an absolutely amazing choice. For consoles that supported both, it's a coin toss of what might look better on one versus the other. And anything, modern, you're probably going to pair it with a flat panel, even for just ease of use. But any CRT for retro is a win, because that's how they were kind of supposed to look. So for anybody who's listening to this, who's wondering, maybe I should hunt down a BVM, or maybe I should just get a consumer CRT, get any. Get whatever you can get the cheapest or free that you could get. As long as it works, use that first, and then kind of go from there and see. And for some people, it's a gateway drug. And they're like, you know what? This does look better. And they kind of, quote, need a PVM or need a BVM after. And that's awesome. That's totally fine. A lot of other people think, I'd love to see what those look like in person. Maybe I'll go to an expo and check them out, but I'm totally fine with this. And, other people are like, you know what? This is cool. I'm glad I did it. But now I have a 75-pound box that's starting to wear out that's taking up space. I'm just going to go buy a Retro Tink and plug it into my flat panel and never have to worry about it again. And that's also totally fine. So I enjoyed answering your question, but I also just wanted to give some more general information for anybody who might just be listening to these now or just getting into the hobby, because I always like to make everybody feel welcome. And I certainly don't want to make anybody feel like RetroRGB is the BVM parade and everything else sucks. That's absolutely never been me. But as somebody like yourself, Tony, who enjoys a bunch of different monitors and appreciates the differences, if you have the opportunity to at least see a BVM in person, do it. Drive to an expo, go to something and check it out. Because even if you decide it's not worth the effort, I guarantee you're going to think it's worth the effort to drive there to see it in person for yourself. Next, Rip Van Winkle is reaching out because I mentioned how a CRT projector can cover all ground for numerous CRT display types, which seems really alluring to pair with a 4K laser projector. I agree, and I plan on doing that at some point. Let me continue with your question. However, many people online have claimed that running 240p games on high-resolution projectors like the Sony G70 and G90 over time can burn scan lines into the RGB lenses of the set, which makes resolutions beyond 240p practically unusable. I don't know about that, but let me continue reading your question and I'll just address all of that at the end. Despite numerous claims of 240p and 480p burn-in being prevalent in CRT projectors, they've yet to see any visual proof of these damages happening to said devices. While they mainly see these types of complaints on a CRT gaming subreddit, they also notice these claims reoccurring on the Kurt Palmy forum, the AVS forum, and places where CRT projectors are still being discussed, but with, again, no visual proof. They've heard that the solution to 240p, 480p burn-in on 1080p projectors like the G90 is to use the built-in line doubler it has for 240p, 480p systems to minimize the effect of scanline burn-in or scanline shift that moves the image around a bit on the tube face. All right, so that's starting to make a little bit more sense. But while I don't own a CRT projector and I don't have extensive experience with it, I could guess what's going on with this right now. So if you picture something like sharp CRT masks on an OLED, now you have a ton of blacked out space and you have a bunch of very bright information coming out of the space that's left. So if you were to only play video games on that monitor, and like especially just for the sake of argument, let's just say you've played the same game for a couple of 1,000 hours using that setup and not used anything else, what you might end up doing is using the non-blacked out area a lot more than the others. So you would have uneven wear, so that when you went to play a full screen image without any scan lines on it, you might see a difference because thousands and thousands of hours were used on some of the pixels, but 0 hours were used on some of the others. So there is no reason why that wouldn't apply to CRT projectors. So stuff like the scanline shift function would move the image around a little bit, because naturally generated scanlines, from a CRT, it's still the same concept of you're using the beam of light to draw the image, and then the space between what we refer to as the scanlines is actually just empty space. So shifting that image around, so imagine, even though there are no pixels on CRTs, imagine doing a pixel shift so that you're switching where the information is. That makes perfect sense, and that could certainly help mitigate burn-in. But I did see in that forum, they're saying don't play 480p content, which is ridiculous, because 480p stuff looks amazing on CRTs, and it's got to look just as good on CRT projectors, provided it's a decent projector, decent screen, and all of the usual caveats and stuff like that. But I do understand the concern. Also, some of the things people were talking about is defocusing the projector a tiny bit, so you don't have just sharp lines between where the video content is being displayed and the blacked out space. And that's going to be preference, but this also comes down to what I talk about a lot in these Q&As, where people are concerned about using their CRTs too much, how to keep them preserved and for a long period of time. And it's my opinion, you could obviously form your own here, that if you have a piece of equipment that you enjoy and you want to use it, but be smart about it. So if you want to play a game, constantly for a couple of days in a row, fine, do it. But don't leave a stock ticker on 24/7 to burn it in. That's just a waste. If you need to do that, you get yourself an ultra cheap used crappy flat panel and let that thing take all the brunt of that stuff, and only use your higher end display when it really matters to you. But use it. Being able to see video content and even video games on a CRT projector is ridiculously fun, especially if you have the eye for this stuff and you want to get into it. So I wouldn't personally worry about any of that stuff. Also, the line doubling function, that must have been really cool back when that was released, because then you could double the information so that you fill in the lines and you don't have any of that empty space between the scan lines. I imagine in 2003, that'd be a really cool way to say, hey, this looks and feels more modern. But now that everything is like that, because remember, even if you don't use a scaler, your TV's crappy built-in scaler is going to double or triple and quadruple all of this and stretch it to fill the screen. So now the whole purpose, I guess not the whole purpose, but one of the many purposes of using something like a CRT-based display would be that you do see the space in between, because that cuts through the information. Now, in video games, that's what makes it look like a higher definition than it is signal, because you don't have that blocky look to them. The space between is cutting through, generating an image that to most people look better. And with TV and movies, when you display it that way, it cuts through that. To my eyes, I truly think it makes film grain blend into the image and feel analog. Whereas on my OLED, it just looks like a bunch of film grain put up front and center for your eyes to see, which I talked about that in the LG C4 video quite a bit. So I understand why Sony would have put the line doubling feature in back then, but now I would never use it, because that's the look I would totally go for. So yeah, I mean, I see your point that, that this stuff is kind of hard to figure out. And I see your point of, there's no proof that any of this stuff happens. It's also really hard to take pictures of projectors in any way. So I imagine people probably tried to take pictures of when these issues happened, but I think it's more along the lines of very long-term use. And I would never hesitate to play a couple hours of a video game in 240p and then watch a movie in 480p instead of 1080p or something like that. So just to finish off your question, if myself or anybody I know has been playing 240p games on a projector for years, they would hugely appreciate the documented results. So anybody in the comments, if I'm wrong, please let me know. I will fire up the Q&As next week, apologize and correct myself. But I would be very shocked if I was wrong about this one. I'm probably getting a bunch of little details and use case scenarios not totally right, but I certainly would not say don't play lower resolution content on higher definition CRT projectors. I would be shocked if that was an actual thing that people had to worry about. But the things that you do have to remember, there's a lot that goes into anything CRT based. Capacitors, calibration, and the weight. One of the main reasons I don't have a CRT projector yet is because I would love to mount it to the ceiling, but I don't really want a 200 and something pound thing hanging over my head while I record these videos. While it might be kind of hilarious to watch me get bonked in the head by a CRT projector falling on me, that's not how I want to die. Might kind of be poetic to do that, especially if I was on stream or something, but that's not how I want to go. So the weight alone is something that you have to worry about, but these take a lot of work and it's a lot of stuff to get running. So that's kind of the whole point of that LG C4 video, is spending $750 on a RetroTink 4K Pro might actually be cheaper than going through all of this effort for a BVM or a CRT projector or something like that. But that's up to you. For me personally, what I would really like is to have a super high-end Sony a CRT projector mounted to the ceiling, and then also a modern 4K laser projector, an ultra short throw, also on the ceiling, but closer to the screen, and have a screen that could handle both. And that's definitely a problem because the new ALR screens are designed to take the image right from the top or right from the bottom and reflect all light that's straight ahead. So that CRT projector's light would then just be dispersed and you wouldn't be able to see it that much. So I would need the right room, the right screen. I'd have to probably spend well over $1,000, probably more, on the right screen for it. So that is absolutely what I would love to do. I would also love to have an ALR type of screen. Basically looks like a giant picture frame type of thing. I would love to have my OLED mounted to the wall, build a bracket behind the panel so that you could hang the screen over the OLED. So when you're not using it, it just looks like a projector room. But if you go to watch regular TV, you could just pop that off, put it aside. It should be light enough to do something like that. That's like my dream setup. So you could have a CRT projector, a laser projector that supports 3D natively, an OLED TV, and then, of course, the CRTs to wheel over. That's my dream setup right there. I don't think there's any chance in hell that I could afford to do that, but you never know. I'm still going to talk about it because if you got the deep pockets to do that, do it and post pictures, because I have a feeling you'd use all of them. You'd probably watch 3D movies on the laser projector. You'd probably watch anything that's pre-2005 and 1080p or lower on the CRT projector. And then any modern movies, you might, depending on what type of movie it is, you'd either do the laser projector or just your OLED TV. So yeah, that's kind of my dream setup there, and I don't think it's going to happen. But yeah, please, anybody chime in. Am I getting this all wrong? Because I just cannot possibly imagine this being a real concern. That would be like saying don't play 240p on a BVM because you're going to have thick scan lines and it might take away from everything else. Like, absolutely not. I don't think that's something I would worry about, but please let me know if I'm wrong. Jason Guffey has a friend with an NES that they recently did a 72-pin cartridge connector replacement for. The Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt cart they usually use for testing worked 100% of the time, but his two games, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle and Spy vs. Spy, are both inconsistent, still despite multiple rounds of alcohol cleaning and using a pink pencil eraser on the contacts. They get the blinking red light of death about 40% of the time. If Mario works completely fine, then the console is working correctly, right? Not necessarily, but let me finish your question. What else should you do with a 72-pin connector or the cartridges themselves? The only other thing they could think of is to bend back the pins in the receptacle a bit, but they don't feel like straining 40-plus-year-old metals carelessly and wanted to check. Is there an issue where certain game cartridges just degrade and lose connectivity over time? They really don't want to take a chance at filing them with sandpaper if they could avoid it, especially if it's not likely to help. So here's my guess. There's two factors. First of all, when it comes to the 72-pin connector, I have absolutely been in that exact same scenario. And the test method for me was I had a Game Genie that I thoroughly cleaned the ins and outs of, and I had some cartridges that I had thoroughly cleaned. And if I used the cartridge, the new 72-pin connector worked perfect. If I used the Game Genie, it did not. And I bought a couple of different ones. Come to find out, they were the same exact ones, just from different sellers and with, the typical Amazon crap that you see. It's the same stuff, probably calling from butt funks, and just labeled with different things. And, it's the same exact factory making them. And it turned out to be the 72-pin connector. And then I was able to find a different brand, or I think somebody had boiled theirs and bent the pins, or did one of the things that people do to them, and that ended up working fine. But I've also seen cartridges that just didn't work right. And in fact, this is one of the cases where, take a deep breath, everybody, Brasso was actually a good solution. I know, the horrors, the horrors. But seriously, if you have a cartridge where you have pins that are severely oxidated and you've tried the rubbing alcohol and the pink pencil eraser method, especially if there was not only oxidation, but a little bit of rust on it, taking a Q-tip and lightly using a little bit of metal polish on it. I wouldn't do sandpaper. I would do metal polish because metal polish is essentially like a very high grit sandpaper, and cleaning the affected areas and then really giving it an alcohol bath afterwards. Like use one of those electronic brushes, which are essentially coarser toothbrushes, and give it an alcohol bath and then let it dry and give it another alcohol bath and then maybe even use a pink pencil eraser again. That did work, except the thing that you need to remember is when you use high grit sandpaper, metal polish, whatever else, you're removing the protective coating on that cartridge. So in the case of your cartridge is already oxidized and not working right anyway, it doesn't matter. You just need to keep in mind, you're going to have to clean those contacts a lot more than you would a different cartridge. But if you have something where only 1 or 2 pins are oxidized, just do one of those 1 or 2 pins and don't do the rest, because you're removing the protective layer on the rest of those pins. So I would kind of break this down. I would take apart the NES cartridges and take a look inside, see what the PCBs themselves look like, see if there's a resistor on it. If that's the case, you could try desoldering the resistor, getting the value and replacing it with a brand new one. That certainly wouldn't hurt. And you never know. I think once I saw a bad resistor. I think it was only once, but that was the fix. Maybe the fix was reflowing it and not replacing it. Whatever. The point is that after the resistor was replaced, the expensive and rare cartridge was back to life. And I think they even taped the original resistor to the inside of the cartridge just to like have it all original in case anybody ever needed it, type of thing. So I've seen both. My gut's telling me it's the 72-pin connector, but I would absolutely open up those cartridges and really take a look. Bright light, magnifying glass, really just take a look and see if you could see anything that stands out to you. And of course, if there's a capacitor in it, you want to probably swap that out too. And this might be a fun experiment, especially for you, Jason, who loves tinkering with this stuff. If it were somebody who's like, look, I hate doing this, I just want my games to work, I probably wouldn't go this far. But if you open up the games and there is no oxidation and it does look pretty clean, but there's any replaceable components on there like resistors and capacitors, I would try to do that just to see what happens, just to run the experiment. As long as you do it right, what's the worst that could happen? You put the originals back in and go back to the way it was. Just make sure the capacitor is in the right orientation and stuff like that. But yeah, for a tinkerer, absolutely run the experiment and see. But my gut's going with 72-pin connector on this one. But anybody else have any suggestions? I think one of the things that comes up all the time is the lockout chip. But I think people, and please let me know if I got this one wrong, but I think most of the time when people think there's problems with the lockout chip, they're actually talking about the 72-pin connector. And then they go to disable the lockout chip, which is safe to do. You could get guides to do that. But they disable it and it starts to work mostly, and they think that was the fix. But it wasn't. It was a cheap aftermarket 72-pin replacement connector that just didn't perform perfectly. So if I'm forgetting anything, please chime in the comments and let me know. I miss stuff all the time, even though I try really hard to get it right. But that's where my gut's going with this. And see what you think. Let me know how it goes too, please. I'd be very curious to see what conclusion you come to. Well, that's it for this time. Before I go, I just want to let everybody know that once again, the YouTube subscribe service, the YouTube community says this community isn't available. Visit the creator's channel to see their content. Again, it happened a couple of weeks ago. It happens now. I'm so sorry. I have no idea why this is so broken. If you support on YouTube and you were trying to ask a question this week, I'm really sorry. Feel free to message me somewhere if you need your question answered right away. But it's frustrating because, for just YouTube, for the free stuff, fine, whatever. We're not paying anything for it. So if it breaks, it breaks. But for people that pay for a YouTube subscription and you have to deal with this crap, it's embarrassing, but there's nothing I can do about it. YouTube's YouTube, and if you complain, all you're going to get is an AI generated response that's probably rude and inaccurate anyway. So sorry about that. So if there were any questions on the YouTube support service, maybe I could figure out a different way Does anybody know a different way for people who subscribe on YouTube to get messages through that isn't through the community tab? I don't know. I'm sorry about all that. But anyway, thanks to everybody who participates in these. Ask any question you'd like wherever it is that you support. Just please ask in the latest Q&A post, because I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Also, I really like to answer these all in real time, as if I was just hanging out with you at an expo somewhere or something like that. And if you support on the YouTube paid service, once again, I apologize. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.